utility menu has send sysx, record sysx, play MIDI, record MIDI, make a backup, prepare media, and then firmware. So if we were to record sysx, I'll go ahead and hit the select key. It's going to find the first available file. It'll start at 000.sysx and then go 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on. So it's going to find the first available free file, and it did. And now it's saying select to ARM. So if I hit select, it's now armed and recording, and then hit select to save. So I'm going to go ahead and send it some MIDI data. I have MIDI-OX loaded here, so let me send it a firmware file, which is fairly lengthy. So I'm going to go ahead and send it a firmware file. So now you can see the data coming in. You'll see the light blinking. You'll see the activity light blinking because it's saving everything onto the media card as it's coming in. So we'll wait for that firmware file to stop, and we'll remember that it's 001. And then what we're going to do is use that file, which is firmware for our Liquid Tracks, and we'll actually have a Liquid Tracks program, another Liquid Tracks, so I'll show you that. In fact, I'll zoom out. Alright, so it's done. I'm going to hit select to save. And now it's saved the file, and there are 93,720 bytes saved in that file. Okay, so now that we loaded the firmware via the record sysx, now we're going to actually send it to the Liquid Tracks below. So let's go into firmware mode. And in firmware mode, it's first going to look at your USB or your media card, and if there's a firmware file, which there isn't on my media card here, if there's a firmware file on the media card, it's going to load it up right away. If there isn't, then it's going to go into the MIDI mode of firmware, and now it's just awaiting me to send it a MIDI file. So I'm going to go up to the top here, select send sysx, and now it just grabbed off my media card the sysx files that are stored on it. And in file number 001.sysx, that's the recording we just made. And I'm going to go ahead and start sending it. You'll see that it's sending, and it'll scroll all the way across. And then down on this Liquid Tracks, you can see that it's receiving a firmware. Now what I don't know is if the file I just sent it is actually a firmware for Liquid Tracks or for a Liquid Foot Junior. I should have looked at that one. Anyway, we'll find out. It'll start loading the firmware if it's a valid firmware file. So it's almost done. So you can store any number of patch dumps or firmware for all sorts of devices, and then while you're on the road, if you need to send them in, you can go ahead and do so. So you can see it was a valid firmware file, and now it's actually programming this Liquid Tracks. We'll see a reboot when it's done loading. There it goes. Okay, so we just reflashed the Liquid Tracks with hopefully the same version. And we did that from a Liquid Tracks, storing a firmware file on the media that it had. So now that's there if we ever need to go back to it. So you can imagine, like I said before, patch dumps or various patch dumps. If you have a Liquid Foot, it could be the entire programming of the Liquid Foot, and you can have many variations of that programming with you, set list related, or the imagination's really the limit as to how you use that function. So that is sysx send and record. Playing a MIDI file and recording a MIDI file. In the preset menu, I showed how you can create a MIDI file attached to a preset and synchronize with audio. This works basically the same way. If we start recording, it'll start capturing all the MIDI data coming in and turn it into a type 0 MIDI file that could be loaded into a sequencer. So you might be pressing your foot controller or sending data out of some other MIDI device, and this will actually just record it almost like a sequencer, and then store it into a MIDI file that you can then load up and manipulate, and then actually load into a bank and use at the preset level. So you can do it this way as well, or you could just create a MIDI file completely outside of Liquid Tracks and tie it to a preset. And make a backup. We'll copy all of the presets into a backup folder. And then prepare media. So if we put a new card into a blank memory media card that's never worked with LiquidTracks before, then we'll go and prepare that media first. This will create all the directories, create the scan files, and then you'll take that memory card, plug it into your computer, and then start loading all your audio files and MIDI files into the appropriate directories that it's created. And then from there, you'll go into the bank menu and then auto program your banks and so forth. So that's what Prepare Media does. And then firmware, like I said before, it'll first look at your memory card, and if it doesn't find a firmware file there, it'll then await MIDI commands. And I'll go ahead and exit out of there. So that is the utility system. Now to shut off your LiquidTracks or put it in standby mode, just hold your select key for about 2 seconds. The standby light will come on, everything else will shut off, and it'll kind of just stay there until you turn it on again. If you turn on the unit with your finger on the right button and hold it, then you'll see as it's booting up, it'll go into firmware load mode, and this is kind of special case in case you need to go ahead and do that. And